Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are going to proceed to our second panel now, and I'm going to turn it over to Gyami Shrestha, who is Program Director for Lynker, who will set the table for the panel. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Will. Welcome, everyone, to this second panel on the role of certification in ensuring carbon dioxide removal integrity. This panel will focus on important components of carbon removal certification protocols and their operationalization, including notions of social justice, additionality, requirements, and the architecture for MRV. My name is Gyami Shrestha. I'm a program director at Lynker Corporation. I've been in the carbon world for 20 years. First started working on soil carbon sequestration, then conducted some research on biochar and forest carbon fires, and most recently worked with multidisciplinary interagency teams and academics trying to bring together different disciplines around MRV and different science policy interests for carbon dioxide removal. So it is my pleasure to bring this panel together today to share their different perspectives on this topic. So we're going to have some early career perspectives from Dr. Elvis Kao, from Dr. Radhika and Dr. Anu, respectively. So our format really will have 15 to 20 minutes remarks from each one of them. And then we'll have about 20 minutes of Q&As. So all of you in the audience, please feel free to jot down your questions in the Q&A section of this Zoom. And we'll be asking those questions at the end. With that, we're going to begin this panel with remarks from Elvis.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me share my screen. So hi, everyone. My name is Xiangkun. I'm currently a Senior Schmidt Science Fellow, and I'm also an active fellow leading a startup company under capture. And today I wanted to talk about what something that really important to me as someone originally grew up in the global south, facing the environmental injustice happening every day. I think right now with the CDR development and also deployment, we really need to incorporate these different justice and equity considerations when we do that. And because we can only do that we can only do that once, and we have to make sure everyone's benefits is being considered in the process. So as I mentioned, I was trained as an engineer, and I got my PhD degree in mechanical engineering in 2021. And if I were to summarize what I achieved, I wanted to start by this. When I studied by the project in 2016, it was a lab scale prototype for converting CO2 into products, which is sustainable aviation fuels. It was a prototype in a lab. When I finished the project in 2021, it was successfully deployed and tested in the field as one of the 10 finalist teams in a 20 million carbon express competition. And I had experience of being an engineer and upscaling a technology to see how that works. And afterward, also spent briefly as a year on a technology benchmarking and standardization. And most recently, as a Schmidt Science Fellow, I developed a huge interest and intersection of CDR technology, business, and policy. And I recognize that human dimensions for CDR technologies are not being talked about enough, especially on topics related to equity and justice. So as an engineer, I decided to learn about justice, learn how do we blend that learnings when we design technologies and when we deploy technologies. And a little bit about CDR, so the audience will be pretty familiar with the topic, presumably. But here, when we speak of a CDR, it actually means a lot of sense. And there's afforestation, there's which is a nature-based solution. There's dual air capture and storage, which is DACCS. This is an engineering approach. There's also hybrid approaches, and here the BCCS bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is a hybrid solution. So this is a really broad topic, and when you think about the different attributes of the technologies, first of all, what about the permanence of the technologies with their so for that the figure actually shows for the different technologies. Some of this can be regarded as permanent sinks, some are predictably leaky, and some are unpredictably leaky. By saying that, I'm actually, for example, for geological stores, they can deliver permanent storage on climate relevant timescale, and others such as biochar leak in a predictable way. And for some non-permanent stores, such as the forest of restoration we just talked about, they can actually present the potential for a catastrophic failure events, such as forest failures. And when we speak about permanency, there's actually no widely accepted definition as a potential industry best practice. Stripe and Frontier, they're currently stipulating a minimum 90% probability of 100% CO2 retention and 1,000 years after emplacement. But again, this is just industry best practice. As the CDR evolves, we still need to develop internationally recognized definition of a permanency. And also, this table illustrates the different permanence and immediacy attributes of different routes. As you see here, dank or dual capture can be seen as immediate removal. And there's also other approaches, CDR approaches, they are non-permanent removal, but they are immediate. And here you also see there's delayed removal, for example, enhanced weathering, BCCS. So, CDR pathways, they can deliver non-permanent removal, they're even more complicated. So I would like to say, as someone originally trained in the engineering approaches for CDR, I'm still in the learning process in understanding all of the different attributes related to permanence and immediacy with the different routes. And with that, there's also different environmental services which can be provided by the various CDR pathways. And for example, you see here for the different pathways, afforestation, they can provide pretty good ecosystem services, biodiversity, air quality, or water quality, to name a few. And for the other approaches, some engineering approaches, for example, dank, right now they have been regarded. We still, as a dank community, still need to learn how to incorporate all of the other services when we not only provide the permanent carbon dioxide removal, but also thinking about, for example, there's certain things such as the co-treatment of other air pollutants, which is something being talked about by the DOE, but we definitely need to think beyond that. And most recently, I had the opportunity to participate in the Carbon Removal Justice Fellows Program organized by NWF and also American University. And within that program, I started to learn from also the lecturers and the other participants about how we could do things right in deployment and development for the different technology and the different routes. And we definitely see there are a lot of gaps out there, and we need to develop data-driven tools and frameworks to address these different social, ecological trade-offs in CDR development and deployment. And these are just some of the prompts here that we talk about. For example, the aim one here is about when you deploy the technology, when you do the site selection, there's actually a lot of things you can think about. Not only the energy resource out there, the water resource out there, but at the same time, can you get the co-location of the CDR facilities to minimize the harms and also maximize the co-benefits? And because the CDR the projects, they can and should offer these additional community benefits so that we can catalyze the different economic and environmental prosperity. And in the past, I had the opportunity to get funding from the CEC in the theme of climate change and environmental justice innovations for resilient communities. In that project, I actually studied co-location opportunities for CO2 utilization next to power plants, and potentially to see how these emissions can be transformed into commodities and also create new jobs for local communities. As the different CDR technologies scale up, we must evaluate these co-location opportunities when we build new facilities to really help these marginalized communities who suffer the unjust consequences of climate change. And in this context, the climate and economic justice scoring tool, which is CJST, it actually is a very powerful tool by the government to identify areas where the communities face climate, environmental, health, and social economic burdens. So we can use that tool and map up the existing sources of the greenhouse gas emissions. For example, the coal and natural gas power plants of cement and steel industries, and look at their scales, and also what other pollutants out there, for example, SOx or PM 2.5, ozone over regulatory levels, so that we can learn about all what is out there, what are the community needs, and also definitely bring the community into the decision-making process, so that we can, when we do the new deployment of the new sites, of the new CDR plants, we need to think about this air pollution reduction potential, and also the other considerations such as the job creation, by from the Justice 40 initiative. There are protocols out there we can follow, but we need to really consider them in the decision-making process. And second, after you do that, you definitely need to bring to develop this monitoring, reporting, and verification frameworks and tools to ensure the accountability for the different projects. And robust MRV, they are pretty important in tracking. For example, the carbon removal amount is credible, but we also need to think beyond that. There are other metrics we can track, use MRV framework. For example, the societal benefits and economic and environmental outcomes. So we really need to blend all of this into a comprehensive MRV frameworks to make sure that we can track the carbon removal activity and also these added outcomes, so that we can help build trust in the CDR sector. So I know Carbon 180 has done amazing work in the sector. So we look forward to the next discussion by Anu about that. But also, and at this point, I wanted to say, CDR is so broad, and it is possible for us to design MRV that works for all, or do we need to develop tailored MRV frameworks for the different, based on the different attributes for CDR? This is something I have been thinking about, and I look forward to learning more. And also, when we speak about MRV, for example, for monitoring, this is also related to the sensors networks out there. And based on the different specifications for CDR, do we need to develop new technologies, new sensor technologies to fit the temporal and the spatial resolutions, are the current technologies good enough? Are they costly? And if we really think about upscaling, can the current sensor networks be capable of capturing all of the new upscaled activities? If we upscale from a megaton to gigaton, are the technology good enough? So there's definitely a lot of open-ended questions here we need to really answer. And also there are new mechanisms we can consider. For example, verification, can we really adopt some of the new technologies such as the proof of stake based blockchain mechanism to verify the carbon removal claims? I don't know, but I think these are important questions we want to consider when we move forward. And lastly, as someone originally from Global South, how do we really make sure we can synthesize and design the best practices for equitable in not only certification, but also collaboration in the CDR sector? Because currently there has been a clear disparity in CDR development across the different geological regions. And we really need to develop effective mechanism to catalyze equitable international collaboration. And to that end, we need to talk about collaborative R&D, IP sharing under a safe net, and also our results. And we need to think about infrastructure sharing for early stage CDR technology development. And also there's expertise training, and so that we really need to think about what the equitable international collaboration or coordination is going to look like for CDR. And is there any best practice we can learn from other mature technologies? For example, adjacent climate tech, such as the photovoltaic. Is there any good lessons we can learn from there to really we can accelerate this equitable coordination on a global scale? And lastly, I wanted to end by some important but outstanding questions. I already talked about some of that. For example, when we speak about community benefits, actually for DAC projects, the United States right now is having the community benefits plans for DAC. But each CDR, as I mentioned, is different. Do we need to develop unified CBPs for various CDR pathways, or do we need to really tailor them based on the different attributes for different pathways? So I would really be interested in continued discussion if you are a community outreach specialist, and also for the different CDR pathways, how do we design the MRV tools and frameworks to fit the diverse needs? And to that end, are the current sensor technologies good enough? Do we need to develop more? And also, is there any lessons we can learn from or borrow from blockchain technologies into the verification framework here? And also, what is the best practice for international collaboration? And also, I think for that, international law and policy experts who have done work in adjacent fields in other climate tech will be pretty interesting to bring expertise so that we can think about that at a very early stage of technology development and also deployment. And finally, if you are willing to learn a little bit about ultrafluidic engineering, I know it sounds boring, but this is what I got my training during my PhD. If you're interested in how we can use that to design better devices and processes for different CDR technologies, definitely let's talk more. And yeah, so this is what I think. I really look forward to other panelists and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Elvis. What an exciting way to start this panel, and I've learned quite a bit from your early career experiences. So please, audience, please hold your questions till the end. We'll now move on to our second panelist, Radhika, Moolgavkar, or Anu. I think it's Radhika. Or
Anu should go next because they're very tight and I'm a little different. So
let's do that. Anu? would you like to go next then? Please, you're sharing your screen, right?
Yes,
All
let
right.
me share my screen. Just a moment. Okay, can y'all see that okay? Okay, I see nods. Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Anu. I lead the Science and Innovation Program at Carbon 180. For those of you who might not be familiar, Carbon 180 is a US federal policy NGO focused exclusively on carbon removal. So we work on the full suite of CDR solutions, soil, agroforestry, direct air capture, enhanced weathering. And our mission is to design and champion equitable and science-based policies that bring carbon removal to gigaton scale. In my role specifically, I spend a lot of time talking to scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, investors, really the whole innovation ecosystem to understand what's working and what's not yet working in the CDR sector. And that feeds into the top of the funnel for our policy development program. And lately, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about MRV. What is it? What is it for? How do you do it? And how should we design MRV frameworks today that are going to serve the purposes of carbon removal in the long run? And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. Can MRV be a tool for justice? In the interest of not burying the lead, obviously, I think the answer is yes. And if you take nothing else away from my presentation today, I want you to take away I think MRV is for accountability. That is fundamentally the purpose of monitoring, reporting, verification, certification, the whole thing. The purpose of it is accountability. And so in designing MRV frameworks, we should always be asking, who are we accountable to, and what information and systems and guarantees are needed in order to be meaningfully accountable to those stakeholders, whether that is buyers, whether that is the government, whether it's regulators or the public broadly or communities. Throughout this process, MRV is fundamentally for accountability. And I'm going to break that down and provide kind of my conceptual framework for how I think about this. But fundamentally, MRV is for accountability. So we need to think about who are we accountable to and what do those stakeholders need in order to have meaningful accountability. That's my little speech. But to get into it, I usually give this talk to audiences that are a little bit less familiar with CDR. So I'm going to skip the, reducing emissions is not enough. We need removals. When we think about, why do we need carbon removal from a very IPCC, UNFCCC climate science lens, we always hear these numbers, right? We need 1 to 3 gigatons per year by 2050 to achieve true net zero. It's the net in net zero. Then we need 6 to 10 gigatons per year to correct an overshoot. And then we've got, 1,000 gigatons of legacy emissions that are already up in the atmosphere. And we need to think about how much of that are we going to control for. But I think fundamentally, we really need carbon removal to prevent suffering, right? It's not the numbers, it's the impacts, it's the droughts, it's the flooding, it's the wildfire, it's sort of everything everywhere all at once. And carbon removal is fundamentally a tool for climate justice. It allows us to address these harms by taking CO2 directly out of the atmosphere. And if you think carbon removal is a tool for preventing suffering, at gigaton scale, we should be able to measure carbon removal as a dip in atmospheric concentration, as a change in global average surface temperature. But we are really, really far away from a world in which we can do that. We are at the, tens of thousands of tons of CDR scale for the newer, more durable CDR solutions. Of course, there's a ton of investment that's already happened in a range of CDR solutions that are floating around in markets as carbon credits with questionable impact or questionable climate benefit. So if we think about the sort of like highest level of this, we want to get to CDR at a scale that is climate relevant and therefore would be detectable in atmospheric concentration of CO2 or global temperatures. But we're really, really far away from that. And so in the near term, we need to build systems that allow us to see if carbon is being removed at a more human scale, at a project scale. And so how do we do that? The answer is MRV, right? So MRV is the quantitative accounting that enables accountability. And while we work towards CDR of really, really high level scale, top-down detectable, we're going to need project level monitoring, reporting, and verification to see if projects are doing what they say they're doing. That's one framing. I also want to note that there's another framing of why we need carbon removal that's very much about carbon removal as setting a floor on an economy-wide carbon price. So if you're a skeptic, you don't think we're ever going to get to gigaton scale, but you could see carbon removal as playing a unique role in setting a carbon price. If you are going to extract fossil fuels from the subsurface, burn them, the minimum cost of addressing the harm of burning those fossil fuels would be the cost of taking the CO2 back out of the atmosphere. But either way you cut it, whether you're looking at that big picture gigaton scale top down or that very per ton emitted framing of what carbon removal is for, you need MRV at the project level to have meaningful accountability in the near term. So framing, how do we know carbon has been removed? We need MRV. So going back to something that Elvis had mentioned, we need monitoring, reporting, and verification, not just of carbon impacts, but of a broad range of project relevant impacts. And so I would include in this carbon accounting or tracking CO2 through the project, from taking it out of the atmosphere or in some cases out of the upper hydrosphere and moving it into some sort of storage reservoir. That's kind of your gross carbon accounting. We also need life cycle analysis. As we've seen from a variety of projects, programs, government funded programs, life cycle impacts matter enormously for climate impact. And so in addition to sort of the gross carbon accounting, we also need to establish net removals by thinking on a life cycle basis. And then last and certainly not least, we need to think about health and environmental impacts of projects. So not only what are the carbon impacts, but what are the broader suite of impacts of undertaking this kind of project or this kind of work? I think there's a discussion, a relevant question here about whether all of these things should fit under the umbrella of MRV, if it should be called a cohesive accounting framework or some other word. But the important thing here is that all of these things, carbon accounting, life cycle analysis, health and environmental impacts, need to be accounted for. They need to be monitored, reported, and shared with the public on some level. So that's kind of, oh, I think someone's unmuted.
Can I transfer it during a break?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
No problem. I'll be in the kitchen. So
Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Okay. We're just going to keep going. So cohesive MRV framework includes these three things. And with those three things, I want to make the connection to MRV and justice a little bit more explicit. I think you've probably gotten a flavor of it throughout my comments so far, but why is MRV functionally a tool for justice? And I want to make three claims about MRV as a tool for justice. First, if MRV enables accountability, justice considerations are embedded in MRV protocols, whether we choose to think about them or not. So it doesn't matter if you sort of look through your protocol and you think about how to make it more just, or whether you don't do that, the justice considerations and impacts are embedded in the MRV protocol regardless. Second, MRV can be thought of and designed as a tool for achieving more just outcomes. So if you recognize the accountability component, you can go in and think about how you design your MRV protocol differently. And third, now is the time to think about designing MRV protocols that incorporate justice principles. So first one, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but if you look at, literally just Google CDR and justice, there are a few foundational papers that come up. And if you look into those papers, they talk a lot about accountability for reasons that are probably clear to you all. They talk about holding corporations accountable for their emissions. How do we do that? And if they're going to use CDR as a way of compensating for residual emissions, how do we know that it's working? These papers talk about the role of government in creating or enforcing accountability that is meaningful for communities and public stakeholders at large. And they talk about empowering communities, accountability, and the positive feedback loop that creates for decision making if you have information and you have the ability to choose what you want in your community or not. So a number of different ways to slice this, but fundamentally, if MRV is about accountability, there are justice considerations embedded in how we think about MRV. Second claim, you can design MRV to be more just. And my former colleague Peter and I spent some time thinking about this last year. I can drop the link in the Zoom as well. But essentially, if you wanted to bake into your MRV protocols this approach to maximizing accountability and therefore using MRV as a tool for justice, what would you do? In particular, what might you do differently from the norms in the industry today? And I think there's a couple of things. First, direct accounting. It's tempting to want to use averages and baselines and models to quantify CO2 and impacts. And sometimes we have to do that because the tools really aren't there to cost effectively measure every single molecule of CO2. But all of these averages, baselines, models need to be backed by empirical data, and that goes on forever. There isn't a point where you just stop collecting data and you can rely fully on the models. And so as much as possible, I think we need to be setting a high bar for measurement and working towards that, even if right now it's sometimes expensive and it highlights the need for new sensor technology or new approaches to measurement and monitoring. So number one, let's hew as closely as possible towards direct accounting and measurement. Principle number two, traceability over time. It can be more cost effective, really tempting to say that when the project ends, the monitoring ends, or we can just kind of call it a day. But as we've seen over and over again in projects in different industries, even after a project ends, impacts persist. So your MRV protocol needs to take really seriously this idea of traceability over time. Third, your reporting component, there needs to be data transparency. I just had a call with the folks at Precision Development who are thinking about building out the enhanced weathering space in the global south. And there's this huge question of where is the data? Where is the data on the soil types that are relevant in tropical countries? Where is the data on the types of crops and the practices that are happening in different places across the world? So there's really an enormous need for data transparency, both from a scientific perspective and from a public accountability perspective. And I would add, in addition to data transparency, there also needs to be legibility and accessibility. If the data exists in a format that only a tiny subset of academics could possibly look at, we're going to be creating barriers to building trust and therefore barriers to deployment. And then fourth, incentive structures. We need to develop incentive structures that minimize fraud and maximize public benefit, because carbon removal is fundamentally a public good. Of course, these priorities exist in some equilibrium with cost. If we make things so expensive that no one will do it, we're not going to be able to scale. But I would say right now, given how trust has been breached in the voluntary carbon market, given the articles that are coming out regularly, in the near term, we really need to prioritize minimizing fraud, maximizing public benefit, and being really vigorously, vocally committed to building trust and demonstrating that we have put in place appropriate incentive structures to reduce conflicts of interest. So that was number two. MRV can be designed for more just outcomes. And the last one, I think we're all pretty familiar with this, but now is the time to think about designing MRV protocols that incorporate justice, because there is enormous need in the CDR ecosystem for rigorous MRV frameworks. You need MRV if you're going to commercialize any CDR solution. Buyers are thinking about MRV, suppliers are thinking about MRV, everyone's putting out protocols. There's a lot of activity in the ecosystem. So now is the time to step in and disrupt the norms of the industry and ensure that MRV is being developed in a way that is more just and equitable and really focused on accountability. And so lastly, to wrap up my remarks, I want to just translate a little bit from this very high level, like here's the conceptual framework for accountability, to what are some specific things that we can do at the intersection of MRV and justice, or MRV and accountability. So one big thing I think is community engagement. I think we need to create pathways, toolkits, opportunities to engage communities directly in this conversation about MRV around what are your concerns? What needs to be monitored? What do you want to see? How do we make that information legible and accessible? There's a whole piece of work around here. And I know there are folks, for example, Kim Mayfield, Lawrence Livermore is working on things like this. So there's definitely activity in this space, but I think more is needed. The second piece is around capacity building. This is particularly, I think it's true in the US, and it's particularly true in countries in the global south, where there's a high potential to deploy some carbon removal solutions. But right now, the measurement needs are quite high, the technical expertise, the sensor technology, the labs, all of that infrastructure. So there's a need to fund sort of technical development and technical assistance across a range of geographies. Third, incentive design. I know that a lot of suppliers, buyers, registries are actively thinking about this, and I think we want to bring those conversations out into the public around how we design systems that reduce conflicts of interest and also reduce, this should say, per credit payment. So reduce our reliance on systems that you get paid more if you generate more credits, and therefore you have an incentive to create rules that generate credits easily. And that brings me to my next point, which is really about standards. We need rigorous quantification standards for carbon removal. And ideally, to build trust, we need them to be written by entities that have no financial stake in selling credits. It's going to be really hard to build trust in a system where the only people who write the rules for crediting CDR also directly make money off of selling CDR credits. And that's not to say that they're good or bad actors, even if everyone's trying to do the right thing and trying to do things as rigorously as possible. It's going to be so hard to build trust in a system when you describe it to someone. Like when I describe it to my parents, they're like, that seems kind of shady. So we want to be thinking about how do we create these standards in a way that is decoupled from the sale of credits? And in particular, what is the role of government in ensuring that happens? And so with that was a lot of stuff. I'm going to pause and hand it over to Radhika.
Thanks, Anu. This was quite thought-provoking, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions to talk about all that. Radhika, please tell us about your perspective.
Thank you so much for having me, and I am really excited to be here. As some of you might know, I'm Radhika Moolgavkar. I am part of Nori. Nori is a carbon removal marketplace. We have been around for a long time, I think since 2017. We launched with soil organic carbon. And then I also lead the supply and methodology group at Nori. So my role is to help look at different types of supply. So we are supply agnostic and want to grow into other parts of carbon removal, including some of the things that were mentioned earlier, like direct air capture, biochar, enhanced wreck weathering. In addition, my voice might sound familiar because I am the host of Carbon Removal Newsroom, and I'm very fortunate to have people like Will Burns on my podcast regularly to talk about various parts of carbon removal, ranging from the science to the policy to the business. So my talk is going to take us in a slightly different direction than the first two that you heard, and it's really about one very specific piece of the standards making and the definition of quality within carbon removal, and that's the idea of additionality. Some people might know that Nori takes a different perspective on additionality and, really doesn't believe that financial additionality in particular is necessary. So I'm putting out kind of a provocative, I think a slightly provocative presentation to get people thinking and, get perspective. At Nori, one of the things we value is the ability to always change and grow. So, maybe our perspective isn't right, or maybe there are things we're not thinking about, but we really wanted to start pushing this conversation because we think it is fundamentally important in helping scale carbon removal and how you do it. So, additionality doesn't matter. All right. Why won't it go forward? There we go. So I'm starting with a quote, which I don't usually do, and but I thought it was really something that kind of encompassed the concept of additionality. So I'm just going to read it out loud. And the idea is the concept of additionality has been the cornerstone of defining quality credits since the international climate agreements introduced carbon markets for climate action. However, never has been so much been said about a topic by so many without ever agreeing on a common vocabulary and the goals of the conversation. So I think that really fundamentally encompasses some of the issues with additionality in that one, it's defined in many different ways. People use it to mean so many things, and nobody really has come to common agreement about what it should do and what its role is within carbon, particularly within carbon removal. So here's a brief history of additionality. I borrowed very, very heavily from a paper written by Stephanie Arcosa at Thunderbird. There's a link to the source if anyone's interested in it. I'd be happy to send it to them, but it's a great overview. She provides an amazing overview of the history of additionality and some of the, different concerns around it. But so the concept of additionality was first considered shortly after the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. And then basically from then, every climate accord used additionality in the context of international climate finance. So at that time, developing countries were looking for additional financing to mitigate and adapt to climate change. That makes sense. Then with the Kyoto Protocol, additionality became synonymous with the supplementarity of an emission reduction effort in activities outside the emission cap assumed on developed countries. So in both instances, you created a scenario that was measured against a counterfactual. And the rationale for additionality was to ensure that policy interventions are causing activity to take place and thus reward only activities that would not otherwise occur, whether these activities would have happened due to regulatory requirements, natural processes, or common practice. So right there, you can see how complicated additionality really is, because it's about a counterfactual that by its very definition, you cannot define because it didn't exist. And then finally, as of 2021, when this paper was written, in the emissions reductions and avoidance markets, so not even within CDR, there were at least 17 different definitions of additionality based on the context and mitigation of the action required. So essentially, you have a whole bunch of definitions. Everybody's using it in a way that makes sense for their own protocol, but maybe doesn't help, with the efficiency and quality of the marketplace. So for purposes of my presentation today, I am looking at two types of additionality. One, financial, which is this idea that but for the climate finance, the action would not have occurred. So I sometimes think of it as a subsidy, right? Like this action subsidized something that could not have happened if that money was not available. And then there's the idea of legal and regulatory, which is but for the regulatory regime, the action would not have occurred. And I think this one is interesting to think about, because when you think of all the regulatory requests that we hear about government intervening and helping set standards and what that looks like, are we inadvertently making additionality not relevant because you will always have a legal and regulatory regime that, the goal for some is to have a legal or regulatory regime that incentivizes carbon removal. So, I think it's important to lay down these definitions so everybody knows what the position that we're coming from. And there are many other types of additionality, but I'm specifically talking about these two. So I would also like to separate additionality as it relates to reductions and avoidances versus additionality as it relates to carbon removal. So I think one of the things that often happens within the carbon removal marketplaces and within generally carbon credits is this conflation of carbon removal and emissions or reductions and avoidances. And they are fundamentally different. A reduction or an avoidance is a negative action. It's, something that did not happen by its very nature. So, but for a corporate or country action, an emission would have been released. So you're not actually trying to figure out the worth of an act. You're trying to figure out the worth of an act that did not happen. And therefore, the counterfactual becomes necessary. So you can see maybe where additionality fits in this framework. But there also seems to be an overlay of morality in when you look at these sorts of questions. And I think Anu used a better word maybe, which is an accountability. Like we are asking corporates and we're asking governments to take accountability for their action and their lack of action. And so, this feels like there's always been this overlay of what is the blameworthiness or the praiseworthiness of the action, and that people react to that to do that. So this is like very kind of esoteric and high level. But what the point that I'm trying to make is that this isn't just about a strict act or or a strict guideline. This is also about what the act causes and how people react to it and the emotions attached to it. On the other hand, carbon dioxide removal, what is it? Carbon removal is a positive and measurable action. Again, as Anu mentioned, one of the things we are most concerned about within the carbon removal industry is really thinking about measurement, really getting accurate about it. And, even though many pathways have challenges, the beauty of carbon removal is it can be measured. We know what we're doing. We're drawing carbon down from the atmosphere that has already been released. So it is not something where we have to have a counterfactual for, because we know what we're doing. We can see it. Well, we can not actually see it, but we can measure it. We can follow it. We can trace it. And it's totally different than something that's not happening. And carbon removal is necessary. It's necessary for hard to abate sectors, but more importantly, it's really necessary for historical emissions, in my opinion. So these are acts, again, that have already happened, and therefore we have to remove them. This isn't the same as preventing an action. And I think that, while it maybe seems obvious, that is often lost in the conversations we have about this, that carbon dioxide removal is fundamentally different, and we need to treat it fundamentally differently. And we need to build an industry that actually works for what we're trying to do, which is remove carbon from the atmosphere. And so really the goal of carbon removal, as Nori understands it, is twofold, right? It's to remove as much carbon from the atmosphere as quickly as possible to ensure the world does not exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius target, and two, to build a really vibrant, flourishing, and environmentally just industry that can scale rapidly before the worst outcomes of climate change happen. So, that is how we view the goals of carbon removal. And we want to make sure that we do it as quickly as possible while also maintaining integrity, maintaining the highest level standards for environmental justice, but also realizing that this is an urgent problem. We need to deal with it today. And we want to build an industry that is as frictionless as possible, that allows all actors to participate, from corporates to governments to mom and pops. We want this to be an industry that is inclusive from a demand and buyer perspective of as many people as possible, because it is obviously a problem that touches us all and that was created by us all. So from that, our point of view is, additionality really does not matter from carbon removal, because it was always about this counterfactual of what would have happened but for an action. And carbon removal is all about something that's already happened and removing that action. And in fact, we think it makes things harder. So when we think about carbon removal, we're thinking about the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that the faster we bring that number down, the better. And we don't think about assigning moral value to why a corporate does it, and it just doesn't matter to us. So we think about the fact that we need to scale as fast as possible. And additionality is such a complicated and unnecessary, standard or idea that it doesn't allow scaling to happen in a meaningful way. We think about it as an accounting problem, right? So we want to say you remove a ton of carbon, and then that liability gets removed from your books. And that is something that corporates understand. There's no concept of, but for what I did, I get credit, right? And so that's where we think carbon accounting should go to, and carbon standards should go to. It removes the friction from project development. We remove the idea of counterfactuals that can never be proved and add unnecessarily complex. And really, the only question you ask was carbon removed from the atmosphere, and can it be traced and measured? So as a final exercise, I've listed here a bunch of questions that Nori thinks about, and I purposely put it on a very bright slide because I wanted to kind of jar the audience. And these are the things that we at Nori wrestle with when we think about whether additionality is necessary or not. And like I said at the beginning of this conversation and presentation, I'm really interested in hearing other perspectives and why people think additionality is needed, because from mine and Nori's overarching goal is to build a vibrant carbon removal industry. And if we need to rethink our position on this, we will. But right now, the things we think about are additionality. Why is it needed? In the absence of regulation, is the feeling good about climate impact the only way to ensure action, right? Like, this helps people move forward. And this idea that but for what I did, nothing would have happened. Maybe it is like the right moral and corporate and moral compass that allows corporates to participate. And, without additionality, does the moral hazard become greater with CDR? Does it allow people to act in ways that are not appropriate? Does it allow, things, extractive industries to continue? I think that's a really interesting question and intersection that we, could have further conversations around. However, on the flip side of it is like, okay, as an example, a DAC provider becomes financially stable. Should they no longer produce carbon credits because they're no longer financially additional, no longer but for the purchase of the carbon removal credit? You do not sell the carbon removal credit. Another question is think about the regulatory framework within the US and the 45Q credit. Is that too much of a legal and regulatory helping hand that the additionality no longer occurs? If we look to the US government or other governments to develop standards, does that mean that legal and regulatory additionality is no longer qualified for? So what I think the bigger question to us is like, what is the future state of carbon removal? And are we creating something that we can grow into? Or are we creating something so rigid that when we have a flourishing industry, all of a sudden we have to rethink what a carbon removal credit is from a quality perspective? And then, something that's very personal to us at Nori, because we work with farmers, is this idea of like soil carbon credits. Switching to regenerative practices is very, very difficult. And if you require financial additionality, i.e., but for the carbon removal credit, the action would not have happened. In this case, the action is things like no-till or cover cropping. Those are hugely expensive pieces of change. And so in this situation, who are you asking to front the risk of switching to a regenerative practice? Is there an equity question here where you ask small leaseholder farmers to switch over without the guarantee of the carbon removal, before they get the guarantee of the carbon removal credit financing? Or wait for it to come through, because it takes a while for soil organic carbon to, build up in the soil. It's an interesting question because it's a different framing on the equity piece that we're intimately aware of, but I think often gets lost in the broader strokes of talking about additionality and its different, applications. So with that, I've left us with a bunch of questions, which maybe we'll discuss as a panel, but just wanting to kick off the conversation on what it means about additionality, whether it's necessary, and if there are better ways to approach it. I cede the floor.
Radhika, you're asking some very difficult questions, but questions that we've all been thinking about in the CDR space. So thank you for helping us kick off this conversation with these last questions on the slide. And we have a number of questions in the Q&A. I will take them in a bit. But Radhika, since we have these questions that you posed, I would like to ask you, what has been the response from the policy sector, from the regulators, from the farmers, when you talk about this? Additionality is not needed.
Yeah, so the easy answer is the farmers love it, right? Because it works with what they are doing right now. It allows them to transition to practices in a way that's a lot lower risk. For those who aren't really familiar with regenerative farming, when you transition from conventional farming to regenerative farming, you have a yield loss up front. So they're actually making less money. They're paying more for new equipment and for new types of not technologies, but for like additional things like cover cropping seeds. So it is a big risk for them. And the carbon removal credits the idea, our hope is eventually they will help them bridge that gap, but asking them to also take on the upfront risk of financial additionality doesn't work for them. And they make the argument, and some may disagree or agree with this, but that every year they're making a choice to continue. So this is an idea of additionality because they are choosing to continue these practices, which they don't have to. That hasn't resonated with people outside of the farming community, but that's certainly the argument they make. As for policymakers and standards bodies, I would say that, you know, for the most part, it feels like additionality is this third rail. We don't talk about it much. You know, everyone assumes it's necessary, and very few of us are out there. And so we haven't really had detailed conversations with people. And this is kind of our goal right now, is to start these conversations. And it's, you know, to be really clear, it's not because we want things to be less rigorous. What we're trying to do is find out the best way to bring rigor. And is additionality really the best way to bring rigor? In our mind right now, it hasn't been shown to do that, but maybe it does. And we're just, you know, so I don't want it to sound like we have this absolute rigid perspective, but that's our current perspective based on what we've seen and how it's applied, and our vision for the future, which seems to make additionality less compelling if you create a flourishing market and there are more important things to bring in quality. And then the final thing I would say is I think most policymakers aren't so in the weeds that they even understand what additionality is, which I think is an important thing to note, that we are also in these weeds, that sometimes we don't realize that the average person can't think about this or have the ability to think about this. So to build a really flourishing industry, we have to make these concepts accessible to the whole world and to the whole gamut of people who are interested but not going to become experts.
Thank you. Other panelists, would you like to weigh in on this?
I love this question, and I think I'm in a similar boat where I do occasionally just show up spaces and ask the provocative question, like, what if additionality just like doesn't matter? Are we like chasing our tails on this additionality question, particularly for removals? And so I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. I think there are certain cases where additionality does become really important, but I think the framing that Radhika and Nori are bringing around what is the long-term trajectory? What does carbon removal as a market, as a climate solution look like over the long run? And what is the role of additionality or some of these other pieces of thinking that we adopted from the legacy reduction credit market look like in this context? And I think it's a really important question to ask. I think I generally agree that removals eliminate some of the counterfactual issues that you have around additionality from reduction credits, where sort of the founding logic from reduction credits was you want the money to go towards the lowest hanging fruit so you can get the most reduction impact as quickly as possible. And that logic really doesn't hold in the removals space, especially as you scale removals, you're using them for residuals. So it's just a different logic for why you have a market for this in the first place. And I think that's one place where maybe you don't need additionality. On the other hand, you have things like, how do you power a DAC hub given our grid today? If you are building a megaton DAC facility today, how do you power it? And how should you think about energy additionality and the impacts on the grid of scaling up DAC between now and 2050? Additionality, I think, matters immensely in that scenario. And that's a question really for policymakers. And if you're familiar with this conversation, it's the same thing that's happening on the hydrogen hub side. It's if your goal is to scale this industry and to do so in a way that generates climate impacts, how should you think about energy additionality? And that kind of brings us around to the standards question and the private market. So should private actors also think about these questions? Should a company that's buying DAC today ask themselves about energy additionality? What is the long run impact of that? Or is that kind of a policy question? And that is really important for how you implement tax subsidies for DAC. All of that to say, super interesting question. I think there are a lot of layers, and as with many things in DAC, they need to be addressed in sort of a context, pathway, project specific level to really understand the implications.
Thanks, Anu. Elvis, any thoughts on this based on your experiences?
I just have a follow-up thought on the DAC hub and hydrogen hub. All of these are local to the US, And the 45Q tax credit is also that's also the biggest reason, one of the biggest reasons Climeworks is doing business in the US, and also all of the down innovations happening here. But how do we create an ecosystem to make sure for example, the country I come from and others in the global south can also be part of the discussion, and especially this is a really nascent field, but we want to what is the best mechanism we can bring them bring the different voices into the decision making process, because eventually we don't want CDR to be other technologies that's deemed as from the north. So this is just some additional layer I wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really a question that we should all be asking ourselves in the CDR world, and if we're not, then I mean, how do we really simplify this? If a farmer or a landowner in a nation, in any nation, US, China, or any, or Nepal, that's where I'm from. How are they even thinking about additionality, right? And how, if they want to become a CDR supplier or join this whole system, how do they go about it? Right? And additionally, so far, I mean, it's not even there for most of them. Or if a young entrepreneur or an old entrepreneur or just an entrepreneur in general wants to start a CDR project, how is this part of this whole CDR business education and awareness building at all? How is that?
Oh, and I want to just emphasize again that simplify does not mean lack of quality, right? I think there are ways to simplify these things and still retain quality because of the very nature of carbon removal. And to Anu's point about like energy additionality, there's LCAs, there are ways to think about this that doesn't require the language of additionality, which I think just would simplify stuff. Like if we had consistent language, but we don't. And so, but I appreciate your point, and it's something that we have struggled with even at Nori, because smallholder farmers, even within the US, who have been historically disadvantaged, right? They have a hard time participating in carbon removal markets because the barriers to entry and the cost of entry is so high, and the cost and the value of the carbon credit does not meet it. And so, how you scale this so single acre, small hectare farmers in India and Nepal and Africa can participate is part of why we want to raise these questions, because we think it gets lost in the broader conversations, and that there are very nuanced things per pathway, as Anu mentioned, and as Elvis and you mentioned, that prevent potential smallholder farmers and others who are from the global south from participating in a meaningful way.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to switch to audience questions. So there's quite a few. We have, I think, some questions. I think I'll get to this one. This is for Anu from the students at Wyndham School's Wood School. You mentioned total goals of gigaton of CDR by a later date. What are the goals for the next 5 years of carbon removal?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't think there's like an answer to that, so I can give you certain different flavors of answers to that. The main goal of a lot of the work, and a lot of folks who are in CDR today, is to scale CDR to see if it can work at larger amounts. And so there's a bit of a as much as we can do, as quickly as we can get through the barriers kind of approach to how much CDR we need in the near term. If you wanted to put a number on it, I think there are a couple of approaches you could take. You could take the approach of look at learning curves for other technologies and then apply them backward to, we want gigaton scale CDR in 2050. How quickly do we need to learn? And therefore, how quickly do we need to deploy in order to get to that place? So that's one approach. Another approach you could take is, what are we using the CDR for? So this is the approach that IEA, for example, takes in its analysis. If you have some power sector emissions that are going to be hard to get rid of in the near future as we're transitioning to a clean grid, and you're continuing to emit, how much of that could you compensate with removals, or if you can't do CCS, so how much would you need removals for that? And so that's how a little bit of how they get their DAC values. I think either way you cut it, you end up somewhere in the range of megatons to tens of megatons between now and 2030 in order to rapidly scale CDR and put us on a trajectory to gigaton scale in the long run. So the other place I would look for a number is the DOE, Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, put out what they call a liftoff report for carbon management. And I think they also do a little bit of this analysis. If we would think about climate goals and what you use CDR for, what are some of the numbers you would need in order to have commercial liftoff? But I think you usually end up in the sort of megatons to tens of megatons range.
Let's move up a bit. I think this is for Elvis and Anu. Radhika, feel free to answer too. Do you think current tools and systems logic deal with the increasing complexity of a highly dynamic system?
No. That's the short answer. I think, and would love to hear Elvis's perspective on this as well, but there is so much noise in the climate system. So getting to the point where we can measure the large scale impact of CDR from the top down as a change in ppm or a change in global surface temperature is an insanely complicated problem. It is just huge. I hope we get there, but I think we're going to have to build up to that and sort of from really, really small project scale per ton accounting to maybe a little bit bigger jurisdiction level accounting, watershed level accounting, if you're thinking of enhanced weathering, bicarbonate runoff into river systems. And a question that I ask myself a lot from the perspective of, what is the role of federal policy in this is, are we building those monitoring regimes as we go along? Are we building the sensor networks that are publicly maintained and feed into public databases so that in the long run, eventually we will be able to tell if CDR is working at scale? I don't think we have that now. And I think there's a lot of work and a lot of questions that, the scientific community, the academic community can contribute to understanding what those monitoring systems should look like and what are the even just like physical thresholds at which we expect to observe carbon removal at different scales.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with Anu, because everything's being evolving process, and every technology is being rapidly evolving at different space for different CDR technologies, and also the monitoring networks is not there yet, and maybe the current monitoring framework is working for the, let's say, the 0.1 megaton scale, but what will happen for the gigaton scale? I think everything is being changing from the technology perspective, but at the same time, policy is also being changing all the time as well, and the biggest reason I think that is getting a lot of momentum is because of the recent past policy to support that, but will that policy be there forever? Naive, I don't think that's true. And also for the different, for other CDRs, right now we don't have a CDR hub, we have DAC hub. So will something happen, and how will these different variables have effect into how we do things right? I think it's everything we are just learning by doing, and but we have to make sure everything from policy, from technology, from business all need to work together at the same time. Yeah, so this is my take.
Thank you. And that question was from Ben Stewart. So Ben, thank you. We have another question from Michael Ford. In order to avoid these moral hazard issues whereby the rest for these credits need business from the teams they're officiating, what structures are needed? Should there be permanent taxpayer-funded employees whose income is independent of the regulated entities?
Okay, this is something I think about a lot, and I've had a few shows on with, and I'm not an expert like Anu and Elvis, but I'll give sort of a private company perspective on this, which is figuring out how to remove any, these moral hazard questions and these questions of interest from processes is really difficult right now, because as I was telling in the pre-call, we have third-party verifiers. We don't pay them, the farmers pay them, because we didn't want to look like we were influencing the verification process. However, the farmers obviously benefit from a favorable outcome on the verification process, right? And that increases their cost. But we made that trade-off thinking that that seemed less egregious. I think when I think about this, the worry that I have when you introduce new actors is you also slow down the pace of things. And so I do agree in that we need third parties to do this, but we need third parties who are also efficient and do it in a smart way. And so sometimes government bureaucracies can get in the way of that. And innovation is not where the government is strongest. They are good at other areas, but innovation, and we've seen this even within the carbon removal industry, where like permitting becomes difficult because it doesn't fit within a very structured, understood way. And so it maybe rightfully slows it down, but there's got to be a balance and a thought in my mind of what that means. And are you willing to make that trade-off? And then do you end up with such a rigid system that you're kind of back to where you were in the beginning, where you aren't accomplishing maybe the goals you had hoped for? So I don't think there's a great answer. I didn't give an answer, but I do think about it a lot. And I've seen different outcomes based on from from small CDR companies as they've worked through this. And it has sometimes resulted in I think unfortunate results, because it stifled innovation and not in a way that necessarily is beneficial to the community, right? It hasn't stifled it for the right reasons, in my mind.
Yeah, I really appreciate the question, and also Radhika's point about what this challenge looks like from the perspective of private industry, and particularly a nascent industry where there's so many small players and so much is changing. And so the way I think about this is that if you look at the voluntary carbon market and what's starting to happen in the carbon removal market, registries and businesses tend to converge on similar business models, because there's only so many ways to pay to do carbon crediting, and folks who are willing to pay for it. And so there's a reason for that. And so it doesn't really make sense for us to go around being like, businesses, you did the wrong thing again. Like this is the business model that works. And so the question I ask is, okay, what else is needed? What other support is needed in this broader ecosystem that is government, that is nonprofit and civil society, in order to address the moral hazard and conflict of interest question, while also having there be viable business models so someone is doing something. And so in the long run, I think absolutely there needs to be a regulator for carbon removal. There needs to be a regulatory approach. Carbon removal is fundamentally a public good. If you fail to do it the way you say you're going to do it, the negative externalities accrue to the public in pretty obvious ways through climate harms. And so there needs to be some regulatory component. As Radhika was saying, government moves more slowly than innovation, and it moves more slowly than the rate of carbon removal learning that we probably need to meet our climate goals. And so kind of how do you bridge that gap between eventually we're going to need regulation. We don't want to do gigaton scale carbon removal without government having some role in making sure it's happening. And so I think this is very much the place where philanthropy and civil society can play a very strong supporting role. And in particular, I'm really interested in the role of philanthropy and civil society in helping to stand up an independent nonprofit standard setting body that's just focused on, hey, let's have some shared rules for how you quantify CO2 and uncertainties across pathways, decoupled from crediting, decoupled from the sale of credits, but really just an entity that holds this standard for quantification. This is similar to how other large-scale industries operate. Large-scale globally traded commodities, ASTM, IEEE, they're creating standards that the whole industry can use, so there's clarity and consistency. Right now, I think in the carbon removal ecosystem, it would not be as trust-building if this consortium was purely industry-led, because of the kind of negative externalities and the breach of trust in the voluntary carbon market. But I think there's an opportunity here for nonprofits and philanthropy to come in and support this trust building around standard setting and to help alleviate some of those conflicts of interest, especially in the super early days when everything feels new and everything is changing really rapidly. And it's easy to lose trust. I think that's the biggest thing that I've learned from working in carbon removal and carbon markets is that it's really, really easy to lose trust. And so what can we do up front to build trust and do so in a way that is durable and credible and sustainable?
Can I just answer something really quick? I really think philosophies have a lot of roles to play in this. And actually, for the fellowship, the Carbon Removal Justice Fellowships I was in, that was in part funded by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And also, but at the same time, so I wanted to also talk about something related to benchmarking for the technology in addition to the moral hazards. So I know from my experience of witnessing, PV is advancing really rapidly because there's, NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, to put up this third-party verification so that we can track the efficiency of the technology over time. I know recently NETL is doing a DAC center to also do similar things to facilitate this acceleration of technology development. So government agencies is doing something to support the technology to make sure everything is valid and is verifiable. I think it's just similar to that. We can probably have, let's say philosophy-led entities to do the third-party verification related to the moral hazards and other aspects, so that we can not only make sure technology evolving, but also thinking about the human dimensions when we move forward.
Thanks. I wholly agree with all of your thoughts on this. That's really important to do, and it's an opportunity for everyone. So I'm surprised people aren't rushing to do this. Maybe they are, but maybe we find out later during this conference. So I have permission from Will to keep the panel going till 12. So because we have a lot of questions, I hope all the panelists can stay. All right. So let's move on to the next question from Ryan Sweeney. Do you see a role of MRV and certification protocols to incentivize different types of CDR projects around different communities? I think you may have talked about this already, but if you have any other thoughts based on some of the examples that he's provided. So he's talking about how we need to incentivize local acceptance of all CDR projects, but some CDR projects have more negative externalities for local communities, for instance, supercritical CO2 pipelines, than others, such as seeding seagrasses. Many frontline energy communities have already experienced significant negative externalities from different industrial energy projects.
Yeah, so, one thing I think about when I think I hear about these things is one that these nature-based solutions, which often get sort of marginalized, particularly ecosystem restoration, regenerative farming, afforestation, have much better public reactions than these engineered solutions. Yet it seems like the industry is very focused on the engineered solutions. And so I think maybe we need to rethink our approaches, or I don't think it's even our approaches, but which gets the most volume of support in like the press and stuff, right? Because I think most people are they understand and they feel comfortable with a lot of these carbon removal, ecosystem restoration type projects, which are hugely beneficial in many ways if done correctly, obviously. The second thing I would say is I'm lucky enough to live in Seattle in the Pacific Northwest. And one of the things that's really struck me is our native tribes are really starting to take the lead on some of these carbon removal projects, particularly around oceans and ecosystem restoration around their shorelines. And that to me is an amazing model of showing how we can let the marginalized, historically marginalized communities really be the ones who benefit and figure out what's best for their land and their ownership, that and tap into their knowledge of their, you know, resources. And it's been they've just kicked off about a year ago, and I think they're making some pretty cool progress, but it sort of reverses the approach. And I think, you know, it's obviously very US focused, but that's been my experience.
That's great, Radhika. Let's move on to another question from Heather Langsner. I think this is Radhika again. Can we look at some scenarios, Radhika? For example, how would your question be relevant to the issue of DOE sponsoring capture and removal for enhanced oil recovery and building pipelines to do it?
Yeah, well, I don't know if additionality helps you answer those questions, I guess. I think, you know, that it goes to Anu's point about policy, like should 45Q be supporting that application of enhanced oil recovery? I know there's differing perspectives on this, of people even probably in this room on that, and it's outside of my expertise, so I don't want to speak to it too much, but I would say that to me isn't that's not what the question that I was at least trying to get to, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear, but to me it was like, as legal and regulatory processes come in play, how does that function with the traditional definition of additionality? And if we put additionality as a requirement, then do legal and regulatory processes can no longer be helpful, because like a 45Q could be seen as non-additional from a legal perspective or a regulatory perspective if you take it to its most extreme. And so how those policies are implemented, I think, are outside of the question of additionality, and, you know, probably more in Anu's realm of knowledge than mine, to be honest.
Just to add to that, I think Radhika, you mentioned this in your talk, that people mean very different things by additionality. And I think what we're talking about here is different from the legacy reduction crediting version of additionality, which is like, is this project or these, you know, 1,000 tons of carbon avoided additional compared to some baseline where someone would have emitted those tons? And often in removals, what we're talking about is what are the system level impacts of scaling this process in the way that is currently implemented, which is a little bit different. So like the energy additionality of DAC question is very much like this. I think the can you do EOR using some subsidy in some context is another flavor of this question. Is like, if we allow this to keep happening, would bad things happen in the long run? And so I think it's helpful to separate those out. Like, is this unit right here in this point in time financially additional, versus if we allowed this practice to proliferate, or if we incentivize doing this practice over and over again, would it create negative externalities that are expected or unexpected in the longer term?
Right. So I've actually received another request that we should end this panel at 11:50, and we have a lot of questions, and only 5 minutes. So I'm thinking we're going to have a record of these questions, and the panelists may be able to answer them later on. So if anybody is waiting to have their questions answered, please look for answers later, maybe in writing, or I'm hoping they can contact you directly. Okay. So let me see if there's one question among all of these that we can maybe ask here. So okay, I think there's a lot of questions on on additionality, and we've already talked about those a lot. How about we maybe go into a question about trust? How trust is extremely important for nascent CDR sector, and how conflicts of interest could significantly undermine trust in the renewables market. How should we think about financial incentives and trust in CDR And related to that, I actually asked an anonymous question earlier in the earlier panel about who pays for certification. What are the range of costs and for different, poor communities or rich communities, poor nations, rich nations, and how those different CDR suppliers or project developers, how can they be proactive in this approach when they really want to ensure that certification is a useful tool for them and not just an extra cost. And these brief answers, and then I'll ask everyone to provide brief comments before we wrap up.
Well, just really quickly from Nori, the soil organic carbon removal credits, it's about $10,000 per project for farmers to verify. And I would say one of the things that would go a long way to reducing verification costs, a totally small change, is better contracting within the farming industry. It's a huge barrier and it causes a lot of pain on the verification side. Very, very small detail, but reduce costs a lot.
I can also add something really quick, because as a startup co-founder for CDR, Frontier Climate is actually in their funding or advanced market commitment. They're actually paying for not only the removal but also the certification on top of that. So this is probably will be relevant to startup co-founders in the sector.
Awesome. And just to quickly, a couple of points to the range of questions that Radhika asked. Who pays? I think ultimately it's always the buyer. Like somehow it's going to move downstream to the buyer, so it's always the buyer one way or the other. You can break it out in different pieces, but eventually it's the buyer. Trust and financial incentives. One important thing to note, I think, is in other industries where there's commodity that's traded between businesses, you have some feedback loop. If your barrel of oil doesn't have the appropriate sulfur content, because it didn't work for the thing you were trying to do. Carbon removal does not have that. So it requires an additional layer of trust building systems, infrastructure, whatever you want to call it, because it doesn't have that feedback loop. And we have to keep that in mind as we design systems. Carbon 180 and Carbon Plan actually hosted a workshop specifically on MRV and financial incentives a few months ago. And there were two big concerns that arose repeatedly in that context. The first was vertical integration. So it doesn't look great if the same entity does everything. And there are reasons, again, why businesses converge on these models, because it's a viable business model in an industry that doesn't necessarily have very high margins. But there's something about vertical integration that feels untrustworthy to some extent. And the second piece is volume-based transactions. So if you're fully vertically integrated and you're highly incentivized to sell as many credits as possible, there's kind of a systematic incentive to reduce quality, and you don't have a quality feedback loop because no one sees the carbon removal at the end of the day. So those pieces together lead you to needing some systems in place that disrupt those negative feedback loops. And as I've mentioned before, I think one thing that is needed is to take standard writing out of the hands of private industry and put it into some sort of independent or regulated entity.
Right, it's 11:50. I think we do need to wrap up. I would like to thank all of you, Radhika, Anu, Elvis, all the audience members, all the excellent questions that all of you asked us. This has been such an illuminating panel for me, and I hope it was as such for all of you too. Thank you.